Celeste Mercer's private jet sat dead on the tarmac in Tulsa, engines cold, just hours before she was scheduled to fly to Dallas and sign a $900 million investment deal. Quinn Aeroworks arrived fast, diagnosed faster, and handed her a quote of $100,000 with a timeline of 3 months. Celeste was furious. She was also nearly out of options. Then Nash Holloway walked over, a single father in a grease-stained shirt who had been working on a training plane 50 yards away, and said he could take a look in 2 hours. Sterling Quinn laughed out loud. Nash checked his watch, thought about his son's overdue lunch account, picked up his toolbox, and walked aboard. If you stay until the end, you will understand why the most dangerous person in any room is the one who does not need to impress you. The morning that changed everything for Celeste Mercer began the way most of her mornings did, at speed, with no margin for error. She had built Mercer Capital into one of the most aggressive mid-market investment firms in the country, and she had done it by treating time the way other people treated money, as something you never wasted and never let anyone else control. The deal waiting in Dallas was $900 million in infrastructure equity, 2 years in negotiation, and the kind of contract that gets framed on a wall afterward. Her flight window was tight. Her partners were already assembled at the conference table, and then at 6:47 in the morning, her pilot walked back down the boarding stairs with the expression that no traveler ever wants to see on a professional's face. The auxiliary power unit had failed to initialize. Without it, the primary engine sequence could not begin, which meant the aircraft was not going anywhere until someone fixed what was wrong. The ground crew ran diagnostics twice, and both times the result was the same. The system was registering a fault it could not route around, and the jet was effectively grounded. Celeste stood on the tarmac in her jacket, phone in hand, running the math on whether a commercial flight could still get her to Dallas in time. The numbers did not work. The next direct flight left in 4 hours. By the time she landed and reached the meeting, the window would be closed, and 2 years of work would dissolve into a polite email about rescheduling. There was no graceful version of this outcome she could manufacture by thinking faster. Quinn Aeroworks was the name that came up immediately. Sterling Quinn ran the largest private aviation maintenance operation in the region, a fleet of service vehicles, a staff of certified technicians, a reputation built on the kind of aggressive marketing that appeals to people who own things they cannot afford to lose. 2 white vans pulled up to the jet within 40 minutes, and Sterling himself stepped out of the second one, wearing a collared shirt with his company's logo embroidered at the chest. He walked around the aircraft with the deliberate confidence of a man who charges by the impression, not by the hour. He paused at specific panels, crouched at the tail section, stood at the nose with one hand resting thoughtfully on the fuselage. A choreography that had been refined over years of performing expertise for audiences who had no way to evaluate it. Sterling spent less time examining the aircraft than he spent talking about what he was examining. He used phrases like primary control cluster degradation and auxiliary source integrity failure in rapid succession, moving his flashlight across panels and connectors with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this routine many times. Not the diagnosis itself, but the theater of diagnosing. His lead technician followed a few steps behind, taking notes on a tablet. When Sterling finally turned to face Celeste, he wore the expression of a doctor delivering news that is serious but manageable, provided you trust him completely and do not ask follow-up questions that require specific answers. The quote was $100,000. The timeline was 3 months, minimum, because the aircraft would need to be transported to Quinn's main facility, where several components of the control and auxiliary power systems would require removal and full replacement. Sterling explained that this kind of damage was not uncommon in aircraft of this age and usage profile, and that attempting a field repair would risk voiding warranties and creating secondary failures down the line. He spoke about liability with the gravity of someone who had never once worried about being wrong, because being wrong had never cost him anything personally. He mentioned, almost in passing, that his team could have the transport arranged by end of day. Celeste listened with the controlled expression of someone doing mental arithmetic in real time. $100,000 was not a number that would break her, but the 3-month timeline was a different kind of damage, the kind that metastasized through scheduled commitments and professional relationships in ways that could not be easily undone. Her maintenance contract with Quinn Aeroworks had been in place for 2 years, renewed without scrutiny because the jet had never had a serious problem before. She had trusted the name on the van because the name was everywhere, and because she had never had reason to look more closely. She asked Sterling if there was any way to compress the timeline. He told her, with a sympathetic tilt of his head, that safety was not something you rushed. Nash Holloway had been at the Tulsa General Aviation Terminal since 5:30 that morning, which was not unusual for him. He had a contract to maintain 3 training aircraft for a small flight school that operated out of the east end of the field, and the work was steady, if not glamorous. Oil checks, avionics calibration, the kind of methodical inspection that fills a logbook without filling a bank account. He was crouched under the nose of a single-engine Cessna when the Quinn Aeroworks vans pulled up to the private terminal 200 yards away. He did not look up immediately. He was listening to something inside the Cessna's engine compartment that he wanted to understand before he moved on. What made Nash look up was the sound. When the flight crew aboard Celeste's jet attempted another starter sequence, running through the diagnostic restart protocol for the 3rd time, the sound that came across the tarmac was not the sound of a machine with a major systems failure. Nash had spent 16 years working on aircraft of every class, from single-prop trainers to long-range business jets, and he had developed the kind of auditory pattern recognition that most diagnostic computers could not replicate. The sequence was cutting off too early, and it was cutting off cleanly. Not the ragged, grinding halt of a component failure, but the sharp, precise interruption of a system that had been told to stop. That was a different kind of problem entirely, and it pointed in a different direction than the one Sterling's technicians were heading. He was also thinking about the text message he had received at 6:15 that morning from the school administration system. His son Caleb's lunch account had a negative balance of $11.40. The automated message was polite and impersonal and informed him that Caleb would not be able to purchase a hot meal until the balance was restored. Nash had read it twice, done the math on what he had in his checking account, and understood that he needed to find a small piece of paying work before noon. It was not a crisis in the way that crises announce themselves, but it was the kind of steady friction that single fathers learned to solve quickly and without fanfare, because no one else was going to solve it for them. He walked over not to intervene, but because he saw Sterling's lead technician beginning to disconnect a panel that Nash recognized immediately as the wrong panel. The auxiliary control housing was accessible from the starboard side, and Sterling's technician was working port side at a junction that Nash knew, from experience, was downstream of where the actual fault signal was originating. He stopped at the edge of the work perimeter, set down his bag, and spoke in the mild, careful tone of someone offering information rather than opinion. He said he thought he might be able to locate the problem if someone gave him an hour or two to check a few things. Sterling Quinn turned around slowly. He looked at Nash's work shirt, faded blue, the logo of the flight school barely visible under a layer of grease, and then at Nash's toolbox, which was a battered metal chest that had clearly been purchased secondhand and carried the dents to prove it. Sterling did not speak immediately. He let the silence do its work, the way people with social power often do, using the pause itself as a form of dismissal. Then he said, pleasantly and clearly, that private aircraft of this category required certified maintenance from specialists, and that whatever Nash fixed during his day job was not comparable to what was needed here. Celeste had heard the exchange from a few feet away and stepped closer. She asked Nash directly whether he had type certification for this aircraft class. Nash said he had held it previously and could verify his credentials, but that right now he was offering to look, not to sign paperwork. Sterling cut back in before Celeste could respond, and his voice had picked up an edge that was not there before, the kind of edge that appears when someone feels their ground shifting. He said Nash was welcome to return to his training planes. He said it in the tone of a man who had never had to worry about his son's lunch balance, and who understood that fact precisely well enough to use it as a point of comparison in front of an audience. Nash did not answer Sterling. He looked at Celeste and told her simply that if he was wrong about where the fault was, she owed him nothing. He was calm about it in a way that was harder to dismiss than anger would have been, and Celeste, who had spent 20 years reading people across negotiating tables, recognized something in his steadiness that she could not quite name yet, but that she had learned, over many years, to take seriously. She told him he had 2 hours. There were people at the Tulsa field who knew Nash Holloway's history, and there were more who had heard pieces of it, and the pieces did not always add up to the same picture depending on who was telling the story. What was true was this. 8 years earlier, Nash had been a senior diagnostic technician at Precision Aero Services, one of the most respected private aviation maintenance firms in the southeastern United States. He had worked there for 7 years, held multiple type ratings, and had developed a specialty in identifying systemic faults in business jet electrical and power systems, the kind of subtle, compounding failures that could be misread as catastrophic by someone who did not know what they were listening for. He had also been the person who first noticed that the fault reports at Precision Aero did not always match the fault evidence. It started with a Gulf Stream that had come in for what the initial assessment described as a full avionics bus failure, a problem that would have cost the owner close to $80,000 in parts and labor. Nash had been assigned to assist on the teardown, and within 3 hours of beginning the inspection he had identified the actual source of the fault, a corroded relay in the secondary power distribution panel. A part that cost less than $200 and could be replaced in an afternoon. He wrote it up clearly and submitted his findings. His supervisor rewrote the report. The client paid for the full avionics bus replacement. Nash found out when the invoice crossed his desk by accident. Nash went to the operations director. The operations director told him that his job was to execute repairs, not to audit pricing decisions, and that if he had concerns about business practices, he was welcome to raise them through appropriate channels. Nash raised them through appropriate channels. The appropriate channels led him back to the same operations director. 3 months later, his contract was not renewed, and the reason given was a performance review he had never seen before, and that contained assessments he did not recognize as descriptions of his work. The people who might have spoken up did not, because they had mortgages and children and enough self-knowledge to understand what raising their hand in that situation would cost them personally and professionally. Nash had a son and a marriage that was already under strain, and losing the job the way he had lost it, not fired for cause but quietly removed. His record adjusted to make the removal look reasonable, had taken something out of him that took years to identify clearly. It was not confidence exactly, and it was not ambition. It was the belief that the systems around him were basically interested in the truth. He had gone to Tulsa because his ex-wife's family was there, and because after everything that had happened, he needed to be somewhere that Caleb could have stability while Nash figured out what came next. He had taken the flight school contract because it paid steadily and because the work was honest, and those two qualities had become, in the years since Precision Aero, the only ones he cared about tracking. He had not sought out high-profile clients. He had not rebuilt his reputation publicly because doing so would have required telling a story that still had living people in it who had lawyers and reputations of their own. And Nash had calculated correctly that he would lose that contest even if every fact was on his side. He had learned, in the years since, to keep his head down and his standards up. He fixed what was broken. He did not invent things that needed fixing. He had turned down 3 separate opportunities to work for companies he suspected of operating the way Precision Aero had, because Caleb was watching him the way children watch their parents, quietly and completely, and Nash understood that what his son needed to see was not success but integrity. The knowledge that a man could look at a problem honestly and report what he found, regardless of what that finding was worth to anyone else. He had never expected to end up in Celeste Mercer's orbit. But when he had heard the starter sequence cut out that morning, something in him had moved before his caution could catch up, the way it always did when the sound of an aircraft told him something that the people standing around it had not yet figured out. Nash began the way he always began, by listening. He asked the pilot to run the startup sequence once more, and he stood with his back to the aircraft's nose, eyes closed, positioned about 6 feet from the fuselage, so that the sound could reach him without the visual noise of the surrounding activity getting in the way. Sterling Quinn watched this from a distance, with the expression of a man attending a performance he found both tedious and offensive. One of Sterling's technicians said something quiet to another, and there was a muffled sound of agreement. Nash did not register any of it. He was occupied with something more specific. What he was hearing was a sequence. The auxiliary power unit was beginning its initialization cycle normally. Voltage was reaching the starter motor. The motor was engaging. Airflow was beginning to build. And then, at a point in the cycle that should have been 4 or 5 seconds further along, the system quit. Not degraded. Not struggled and failed. Quit. Clean, as if something had told it to. Nash opened his eyes and walked slowly along the fuselage toward the starboard access panel on the lower tail section, the one that housed the auxiliary power unit's safety interlock circuit, a set of sensors and switches designed to prevent the APU from operating under conditions that could cause damage. He crouched down and looked at the panel without opening it. He asked Sterling where his team had found evidence of the control cluster degradation mentioned in the assessment. Sterling told him it was in the primary bus readings. Nash asked if he could see the diagnostic readout. Sterling said the readout was proprietary to Quinn's equipment. Nash nodded, unsurprised, and asked instead whether Sterling's team had checked the APU interlock circuit before moving to the primary bus. There was a pause. Sterling said the interlock circuit had been checked as a matter of standard protocol. Nash asked which interlock, specifically, because there were 3 in this aircraft configuration, and he wanted to know which one had been cleared. The pause this time was longer. One of Sterling's technicians looked at his tablet. Sterling said the full circuit array had been assessed. Nash stood, unlatched the starboard access panel, and swung it open without asking anyone's permission. Celeste watched from 20 feet away, arms crossed, calculating something that had nothing to do with maintenance and everything to do with the 2 men she was observing. Sterling took a step forward and then stopped, because the correct move, ordering Nash away from the aircraft, would have required him to be certain that Nash was wrong, and Sterling was no longer entirely certain of that. Inside the panel, Nash worked through the interlock array with a small flashlight and his fingertips, checking each component in sequence and narrating quietly as he went. The thermal sensor was clear, the pressure switch was clear, the position safety lock, a small rotary mechanism that confirmed the APU's access door was fully sealed before allowing the start cycle to complete, was not seated flush. It was off by a few millimeters, just enough that the contact was not making cleanly, just enough that the system's logic circuit was reading it as an open condition and aborting the startup before the APU could build power. It had likely been that way since the last time the access panel had been opened, which, according to the aircraft's maintenance log, had been 6 weeks earlier during a routine service inspection conducted by Quinn Aero Works. Nash held his flashlight on the mechanism and said, without turning around, "The fault is here, not in the control cluster, not in the auxiliary source. Right here." Sterling told him that a misaligned interlock would not explain the bus readings his equipment had returned. Nash said, still without turning around, that the bus readings would normalize completely once the APU could complete a full initialization cycle, and that any secondary anomalies in the bus data were downstream effects of the startup abort, not independent faults. He said it the way someone says something they have known for a while, and are only now being asked to explain out loud. Celeste looked at her watch. It was 8:22 in the morning. She had given Nash until 10 o'clock. She told him to proceed. What followed was not dramatic in the visual sense. There was no racing against failing systems or improvised heroics with borrowed tools. Nash worked the way skilled people work when there is real pressure, deliberately, without waste, with the full attention of someone who knows that speed and accuracy are not opposites, but expressions of the same discipline. He retrieved a contact alignment tool from his toolbox, a small, precise instrument designed for exactly this kind of mechanical repositioning, and set to work on the interlock mechanism with the patience of someone who understood that rushing a 3mm adjustment would simply mean doing it twice, and he did not have time to do it twice. Sterling Quinn paced. He made 2 phone calls, spoke in a low voice, and returned each time looking slightly more composed than he had before, in the way of someone rehearsing a version of events and finding it more reassuring than the events themselves. His technicians had stepped back from the aircraft and were standing in a loose cluster near the Quinn vans, not quite watching Nash and not quite looking away. Celeste stood apart from all of them, her assistant hovering nearby with a phone showing the live itinerary for Dallas, updating every few minutes with revised calculations for flight time and ground transit to the meeting location. Nash cleaned the contact surface of the interlock mechanism with a solvent cloth, checked the alignment of the lock body against its mounting bracket, and identified a slight deformation in one of the bracket's retention tabs. Minor physical damage, consistent with someone having closed the access panel in a hurry, without ensuring the mechanism was fully reseated before securing the door. He used a small alignment press to restore the tab's geometry, seated the lock body into its correct position, and verified the contact closure with a multimeter. The reading was clean. He checked it twice, then a third time. He cross-referenced the service date in the maintenance log against the aircraft's recent flight history and found the correlation he had expected. The access panel had been opened 6 weeks earlier during a service visit conducted by Quinn Aero Works. The log entry described a routine APU compartment inspection and noted no anomalies found. Nash did not say anything about that yet. He closed the access panel, secured the latches in sequence, and replaced the cover plate over the interlock sensor housing. He packed his tools back into the chest methodically, closing each compartment as he finished with it, taking no shortcuts even at the end of the job. Then he stood, rolled his shoulders once, and told the pilot that the aircraft was ready to attempt a normal startup sequence. The pilot climbed back aboard. Sterling Quinn had gone very still near the vans. Celeste had stopped looking at her watch. Nash stood clear of the aircraft, toolbox at his side, and watched the starboard side of the fuselage in the same quiet way he had stood listening to it 2 hours earlier. The auxiliary power unit lit. The startup sequence ran through its full cycle. 5 seconds, 8 seconds, the building whine of compressed air beginning to move, the generator coming online, the satisfying authority of a system doing precisely what it was designed to do. The pilot's voice came over the ground frequency, all systems normal, APU stable, ready to proceed with engine start. Celeste Mercer stood on the tarmac and said nothing for several seconds. Sterling Quinn said nothing either, but for a completely different reason. Nash checked his watch. It was 9:41. He had time. Celeste walked over to Nash with the directness of someone who had just recalibrated an important calculation. She asked him what she owed him. Nash wiped his hands on a shop rag and said a fair inspection fee was fine. He had a parts charge of less than $20 for the solvent cloth and contact compound, and whatever she thought his time was worth for 2 hours of work. He said he needed to put something in his son's lunch account before noon. That was the extent of his requirements. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Celeste's assistant stopped typing. One of Sterling's technicians turned away, either out of embarrassment or something adjacent to it. Celeste had spent 2 decades in rooms where people stated what they wanted, and what they wanted was almost always larger and more aggressive than what the situation actually required. She had been quoted $100,000 that morning by a man in an embroidered shirt who had arrived in 2 vans and brought a tablet for taking notes. The man who had actually solved the problem was asking her to cover his son's school lunch account. Sterling moved before the silence could harden into something he could not manage. He stepped forward and said, with the practiced authority of someone reclaiming a room, that what Nash had done was a field adjustment and did not address the underlying degradation in the control and power systems that his assessment had identified. He said the aircraft was flying on a temporary correction. He said the responsible course of action was still to bring the jet to his facility for the full diagnostic workup, and that Celeste's insurance requirements likely mandated it anyway. He said this with such smooth confidence that for a moment it almost sounded like a reasonable position. Nash looked at him for the first time since Sterling had laughed on the tarmac. He said that if the full control cluster had been replaced as Sterling proposed, the interlock mechanism, which still showed the deformation pattern from whoever had closed that access panel improperly 6 weeks ago, would have been discarded with the rest of the removed hardware. The evidence of how the fault had actually originated and when would have gone into a disposal bin at Quinn's facility, and there would be no record of what had been found or not found. Nash said this without accusation, in the tone of someone pointing out a fact about how the physical world works when people stop paying attention to it. Celeste looked at Sterling, then she looked at Nash. Then she asked the question that had been building since Nash had opened the access panel. Whether this kind of service history, a vendor's own technicians opening a panel, failing to reseat a critical mechanism, logging no anomalies, and then arriving weeks later to quote a 6-figure repair for the failure that their visit had caused, was unusual, or whether it was something Nash had encountered before in this industry. Nash said that he had seen it before. He did not elaborate. He did not need to, and they both understood that. Whitney Boone had been at the Tulsa Air Center for a different reason entirely, following up on a compliance filing from a charter operator when the Quinn AeroWorks vans had drawn her attention in the way that significant events sometimes draw the attention of people who are positioned correctly to notice them. She was a senior aviation safety investigator with the Regional Oversight Office, and she had a file on Quinn AeroWorks that had been open, intermittently, for almost 3 years. The file had no definitive evidence. It had patterns. She found Nash near his workbench after Celeste's jet had departed. She told him who she was and what she was looking for, and Nash listened without surprise, the look of someone who had been waiting for a conversation like this, without knowing when it would arrive. He walked her through the interlock mechanism, the deformation pattern, the service log entry from 6 weeks prior. He had taken photographs on his phone before closing the panel, a habit he had developed long ago and never stopped practicing, even when there was no audience for the documentation. The photographs showed the contact surface, the retention tab deformation, and the misalignment angle with enough clarity to be meaningful to someone who understood what they were looking at. Whitney spent 40 minutes with the photographs and the maintenance log. Then she made 3 calls, and then she returned to her car and spent another hour pulling records on Quinn Aeroworks' service history for 6 other aircraft that had passed through their facility in the past 18 months. What she found was not a smoking gun, but it was closer than anything she had assembled before. A pattern of high-cost repair recommendations that followed routine service visits on a timeline that was statistically unusual. Aircraft that came in for scheduled inspections would develop faults at intervals of several weeks that required significant expenditure to correct. The faults were consistently located in systems that Quinn's teams had accessed during the routine visits. Individually, each case was explainable. Together, they described something that did not occur naturally. Gideon Hart arrived at the field that afternoon, which surprised Nash because he had not called him. Gideon had heard through the informal network of people who work in small aviation, mechanics, dispatchers, fuel handlers, the connective tissue of any active airport, that Nash Holloway had diagnosed a fault that Quinn Aeroworks had priced at $100,000 and corrected it for the cost of a contact cleaning. Gideon had trained Nash 11 years earlier, during Nash's first years in business jet maintenance, and he had followed Nash's career with the specific attention of someone who helped build something and wants to see it treated fairly by the world. He had felt the way Nash's departure from Precision Aero had gone, even from a distance, like a stone in his boot that he had never fully worked free. Gideon told Whitney, on the record, that Nash Holloway was among the most technically precise diagnostic technicians he had trained in 30 years. He said Nash's ability to diagnose faults through auditory pattern recognition and logical circuit tracing was not common and represented a form of judgment that formal certification processes tested inadequately, because it was fundamentally a skill that machines did not replicate well. He also told her that Sterling Quinn's name had come up in conversations about inflated repair assessments going back several years, always in the context of clients who lacked the technical background to evaluate what they were being told. The complaints had never consolidated into a formal case because the clients had paid and moved on. Gideon said that tended to be how these arrangements persisted, not through any single large deception, but through the accumulated weight of many smaller ones, each just plausible enough to survive without scrutiny from people who trusted the embroidered shirt more than the worn one. Celeste Mercer landed in Dallas with 40 minutes to spare. She had made 4 calls during the flight, 2 to her legal team, 1 to her head of operations, and 1 to Whitney Boone, whose card Nash had passed along before Celeste boarded. The legal call was about the maintenance contract. The operations call was about her fleet's full-service history with Quinn Aeroworks over the past 2 years. By the time the wheels touched down in Dallas, she had a clearer picture of that history than she had possessed that morning, and it was not a picture she found acceptable. She signed the $900 million deal. She was precise and focused, and gave the negotiation exactly what it required, because that was what she did, and because the people across the table had earned her full attention and were not responsible for what had happened on the tarmac that morning. But at the end of the meeting, when the documents were executed and the room had relaxed into the particular warmth of completed agreements, she made an announcement that was not on the agenda. She told the assembled partners that she would be pausing her fleet's long-term maintenance contract with Quinn Aeroworks pending an independent technical review, and that she was referring the matter to the Regional Aviation Safety Office for further evaluation. She said it calmly, as a statement of fact, and moved on. Sterling Quinn was reached by video call the following morning, in a meeting that included Celeste, 2 members of her operations team, and Whitney Boone in an advisory capacity. The meeting was civil in format and devastating in content. Sterling was shown the photographs of the interlock mechanism. He was shown the service log entry from his team's visit 6 weeks prior. He was shown the pattern analysis Whitney had assembled from the broader service history, and he was asked, specifically and plainly, how his team had conducted an APU compartment inspection and logged no anomalies when the interlock mechanism bore clear physical evidence of deformation that would have been visible to any trained technician working in that confined space. Sterling offered explanations. The explanations were not consistent with each other. He suggested the deformation might have occurred after his team's visit. He suggested that Nash might have caused it during his own inspection, which required ignoring the chronological logic of the maintenance log entirely. He suggested that the diagnostic equipment his team used was more sophisticated than visual inspection alone, which did not explain why sophisticated equipment had failed to detect a fault that Nash had located by listening to the startup sequence from outside the aircraft with his eyes closed. Each explanation created the space for the next question, and the next question was worse than the one before it, in a progression that had no good ending for Sterling. Celeste did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice in a professional context in years, because she had learned long ago that the most effective form of authority was the kind that did not need volume to be felt. She told Sterling that the contract review would proceed, that the safety investigation would proceed independently of anything he said in this meeting, and that she was releasing a statement to the aviation trade press noting that she had suspended her maintenance arrangement with Quinn Aeroworks pending the outcome of an independent audit. She thanked him for his time and ended the call. The silence in the room afterward was its own kind of verdict. Nash was at his workbench the following Thursday when Celeste called. She had sent a message the day before asking for a time to speak, and Nash had written back with the hours he was available. Before 7 in the morning or after 5 in the afternoon, because the day in between was already accounted for. The call lasted 22 minutes. Celeste offered him a contract to provide independent diagnostic services for her company's aircraft fleet, 4 business jets and 2 turboprop transports, on a quarterly inspection schedule plus on-call availability for fault assessment. The compensation she named was more than Nash had earned in any previous year of his professional life. He listened to the full proposal without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is making sure they understand what they are agreeing to before they agree to it. Then he said yes, with conditions. The conditions were 3. Every assessment had to be documented in full, with a line-item breakdown of every component evaluated, every reading taken, and every fault identified. No repair recommendation could be issued without a written explanation of why the specific repair was necessary based on the evidence found, not on precautionary theory or revenue targets. And if Nash found something that was not broken, he would say it was not broken, regardless of whether fixing it anyway would have been profitable. Celeste said those were not conditions she found difficult to accept. Nash said he was glad, because they were not conditions he was willing to remove from the table. Celeste also said she owed him an apology. Nash told her she did not have to. She said she was doing it anyway because she had looked at him on the tarmac that morning and seen what someone in a worn work shirt with a second-hand toolbox looked like through the lens of her assumptions, and what she had seen had been wrong in ways that mattered, and she thought it was worth saying so directly rather than letting it settle into the unacknowledged space where those kinds of mistakes usually live. Nash received the apology in the same way he had received Sterling Quinn's mockery, without particular heat in either direction, because both had been less about him than about the people delivering them. He put money in Caleb's lunch account before the end of the call, enough for the rest of the semester, with some left over. Several months passed. Nash kept the shop at the east end of the Tulsa field, but the sign above the door had been repainted. It read in plain block letters, Holloway Aviation Diagnostics, Independent Assessment Services. He had not hired a staff. He had not bought new equipment except for one precision measurement instrument he had wanted for years and finally allowed himself to purchase. He drove the same truck. He brought Caleb's lunch to the field on days when school let out early, and the boy would sit on an upturned fuel drum and watch his father work and ask questions that Nash always answered, no matter how long the answer took, because those were exactly the kinds of questions he wanted his son to be asking. Whitney Boone's investigation of Quinn Aero Works remained ongoing, with multiple former clients having come forward after Celeste's statement appeared in the trade press. Sterling Quinn had retained legal counsel and was cooperating in the limited way that people cooperate when cooperation is managed by attorneys whose primary goal is to limit exposure. The outcome was not yet settled, but the pattern that had persisted for years through the silence of people who had paid and moved on was no longer silent. That, Nash thought when he thought about it at all, was probably enough. On a Tuesday morning in early autumn, an older pilot Nash recognized from the field's community hangar taxied in with a Beechcraft Bonanza that had been running rough on climb. The pilot climbed out, handed Nash the logbook, and said the shop in Bartlesville had told him it was probably a magneto issue requiring a full overhaul. Nash took the logbook, set it on his bench, and walked around the aircraft once slowly, the same way he always started, paying attention to what was there before anyone told him what to look for. He asked the pilot to run the engine up once while he stood near the cowling. He listened. The roughness was there, intermittent and faint, and it carried a particular character Nash recognized from a long time ago. He put his hand on the cowling, feeling the vibration pattern through the airframe, and something in his expression settled into the specific calm of a man who has just heard something speak clearly to him. He looked at the pilot, set the logbook back on the bench, and said, "Let me hear it start from the beginning." He picked up his toolbox and walked back toward the aircraft, unhurried, certain, carrying exactly what he needed and nothing more. The same man he had always been, doing the same work he had always done, for the same quiet reason he had carried with him since the morning he stepped aboard a stranger's grounded jet and listened until the machine told him the truth.
Working. I'm dead. Oh. I'm out of health, guys. That was dumb. Oh. Fuck. That's tough, bro. What's up, Jackson? Welcome in. Right. Well, thank you, guys. Run up those likes to 10,000. Let's get it. We got it. Back. Oh, you're good with your thing. Oh, yeah. Hell to the yeah. What do these do? Interesting.